Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you copy it in the?
Yeah.
I think we can keep it in the USB, no? I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Rich, did we try the lights of the panel? It, and if we use these working lights,
You could use workers. Do you want to use workers?
yeah, I think that would, because if we.
Yeah, yeah. Why have you lost your screen?
What?
Why have you lost your screen? There we go. Yeah, that come out.
Oh. Well, Brandon asked me, and I said that you can see better, much better from down there, so why not wait for you to do your presentation? And after the presentation, yes, or he may not have got that message, so he may sit down there. If it won't take him over to get people back up. By the way, I need to bring the release forms, which I should have got to Alejandro before, but unfortunately we both totally forgot last night. I have to go home for it won't take 10 minutes. Don't take John Paul away before he signs his form.
We'll do that at lunchtime.
Yes.
Yeah, he said he was going to stay for lunch.
Yes, good. There's me, by the way, right there. And QM2. Sorry. This is on. Start from here, I'll stand back. I think probably time to call people to order.
Is everyone back?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I hope everyone managed to get a coffee. I can tell by the noise that there's a higher level of caffeine flowing through the room, which is encouraging and which is what we want for this next session. So I'm really happy to and honored to have been asked to chair this next session, which is focused on infrastructures for building peace. We're going to be looking at a number of case studies, examples from 4 different regions of the world to get a bit more of an understanding and have a discussion about what are some of the kind of social, political, economic structures that need to be in place in order to help support and maintain transitions from transitions out of conflict. And for me, when I was listening to the two presentations before this one, I was trying to think about how to kind of connect that up. And for me, when I'm thinking about what do we mean when we're thinking about infrastructures for peace, I really enjoyed John Paul's graphics and the spider web graphics in particular. And I'm thinking about, what are some of those nodes? What are some of those areas where people can come together to discuss and work through the kinds of tensions and issues that we're facing, and what's some of the learning that we can take from different contexts. So I'm really pleased that we've got 4 experts, wonderful speakers who are gonna talk to us from 4 different contexts. We'll be starting with Reverend Dr. Liz Carmichael. So Liz is Emeritus Research Professor here at St. John's College, and of course the convener of the Ox Peace Network. So we're all here because of the hard work that Liz and others have put in. There'll be time for lots of that at the end. So Liz is one of those kind of rather annoying people who is expert in many different things. Liz studied medicine here at Oxford before going and working as a doctor in Soweto, in South Africa for many years before coming back and doing a doctorate here in Oxford. And then returning to South Africa, where she's worked in the Anglican Diocese of Johannesburg and was very much involved in the National Peace Accords. And so Liz is going to be speaking to us about some of the experience from those accords. Following that, we'll ask Dr. Andre Gomez Suarez, who'll come and talk to us about his experiences in supporting multi-level infrastructures for peace in Colombia. Andre is a senior research fellow at the Center for Religion and Reconciliation at Winchester University, and is also the co-founder of the peace-building organization Podemos el Diálogo. Following that presentation from Andre, I'll ask Professor Brandon Hamba to come and talk about experiences from the Northern Ireland peace process. Brandon is the chair of the peace studies at Ulster University and in the International Center of Conflict Research Institute. And then finally, Raja Katakaya will come and speak to us about his experiences supporting community level peace building in Afghanistan and Iraq. Raja is the outgoing visiting research fellow at the Oxford Center for the Changing Character of War, as well as having worked as a political affairs officer in the UN, and he'll be talking to us in a personal capacity based on his experiences and research in this area. I've already spoken longer than I was meant to, so I'm going to hand over directly to Liz to get us started.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to South Africa, preferably on QM2. It's a wonderfully elegant experience. So what was the problem in South Africa? In one word, it was apartheid. Apartheid itself was complex. It was not simple. It separated people. It literally means separateness. It didn't just separate black and white. It separated black from black, Indian from African, and colored or mixed race from everybody else. And it was cruel. Everything that had been segregated simply by custom before was now segregated by law. So where black people had, for example, been able to attend liberal English-speaking universities, they were now prevented. Grand Apartheid was the plan that set up 10 tribal homelands, and all Black Africans in South Africa consequently lost their South African citizenship and became putative citizens of their tiny homeland, of which there were 10, and they were supposed to take independence and become internationally recognized countries. Only South Africa ever recognized the 4 that did opt to independence. Independence meant that you got your own defense force and your own diplomats, and the only place you could put your diplomats was Pretoria. And the consequence of having a small army is that 3 of the homelands, and I will get them up in a moment, 3 of the 4 that opted for independence became military dictatorships, having had a military coup. That's not working at the moment, so I can't make it much bigger, I'm afraid. But that's South Africa. The 4 homelands that opted for independence were Ciskei, Transkei, Venda, that black blob at the top, and an archipelago of about 7 pieces, which formed Bophuthatswana. So you've got these objects recognized as independent by the apartheid government, and you'd got 6 other tribal homelands. To some degree, that meant that some Black Africans had a stake in the system. So that's Grand Apartheid, and under it, every Black African was supposed to have their family eventually only in the homeland or Bantustan, and they would, if needed as workers in the vast majority of South Africa, they would have to come as single migrant workers, and huge hostels were built to house these single migrant workers, single in inverted commas. There was also Bantu education, which was an inferior education syllabus for Bantu Black African schools. This all came in 1948 and was implemented through the 50s. In 1960, there was a big protest in a place called Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg, and that's when violence really set in. 69 protesters were shot, mainly in the back, running away by frightened police after a 5-hour standoff, during which the police were reinforced. So that led to, in response, the founding of a liberation army by the African National Congress, the ANC, which had been founded in 1912 and had been a very gentlemanly operation up to that point, although young leaders like Mandela in the 1940s began to really organize protest against apartheid. So the ANC had been non-violent, but when armed resistance began, and there were a couple of other small liberation armies as well, then South Africa became a security state, with laws suppressing opposition under the name of, sounds familiar, communism and terrorism. So if you were against the government, you were a communist and probably a terrorist as well. So internal opposition was suppressed, and a big external anti-apartheid movement began to come into being. Internal unrest really was endemic from 1976 onwards, when in 1976 the school children of Soweto began to rise up against Bantu education. And in the 1980s, there was really chaos. There was one major conflict, the majority against the apartheid government, and there was another conflict as well, which had developed within it and alongside it, and that was the conflict within the Black community, which pitted conservative Zulus organized by the Inkatha movement in conflict with the progressives of the ANC, especially the younger comrades. So by 1990, both conflicts were raging. The people versus the government with its police force and army, and the conservative Zulu Inkatha party versus the ANC, which, although it was banned, had internal supporting movements. And the internal civil war was entirely up at first confined to KwaZulu-Natal here on the coast. So in 1990, in February, the new white president, realizing after apartheid was really collapsing and crumbling from within throughout the 1980s, realizing that there had to be radical change, he unbanned the liberation movements, released Mandela, and expected talks to begin. So there were two expectations. The talking would begin to formulate a new non-racial constitution and to have the first democratic election. And the ANC Inkatha civil war should stop, because both Mandela and the Inkatha leader, Buthelezi, had known each other for many years. They did respect each other, and the expectation was that they would meet. But hawks within the ANC prevented any meeting for a year. And meanwhile, that civil war spread up to the townships in the industrial area of Johannesburg and its surrounds. So a crisis was reached when the ANC announced that it would stop talking to the government if the government, for which it blamed all the violence, did not stop the violence by May 1991. And at this point, a group of church and business leaders got together, top leaders, such as Desmond Tutu and the chair of the South African Chamber of Business. And here they are, looking very pleased because they have managed to intervene in the political process. It's the 22nd of June, and they've got everybody who mattered, except the extreme white right, into a meeting to discuss a peace agreement or peace agreements. And they are pictured at the small, short photo opportunity for the media before this closed door discussion, which agreed to negotiate what became the National Peace Accord. So we have now a multi-party, multiracial committee forming, under which working groups work on things like a code of conduct for the political parties and agreements for the police to become a police force that is governed by the philosophy of community policing and not a sort of colonial style repressive force. So from this moment on, June 1991, we have the negotiation of the peace accord, and it only takes 3.5 or so months. And in September, the result was the National Peace Accord, which, when printed, is a small booklet of 33 pages, A5 size. It was signed at the National Peace Convention on the 14th of September 1991 by 29 political and labor organizations, including the top 3 signatories, de Klerk, Mandela, and Buthelezi. And here they are at the National Peace Convention. The word convention was significant because South Africa was invented at the National Convention of 1908 to 09, when the Union of South Africa was formed out of the 4 colonies before the post-South African Boer War colonies. So the idea was to have another convention which would be inclusive, and this was the first one. They're all looking rather pleased, and I think it's because Desmond Tutu, who led the prayer at the end, had just told a funny story. However, although they're looking pleased, many of their followers, and Mandela and Buthelezi at least themselves at times, still regarded themselves as being at war. They were still keeping their powder dry. There had been efforts at agreements before. Was anything going to be different this time? Well, it was, and the difference lies in one word: implementation. So the National Peace Accord set up peace structures and infrastructure for peace to do peacemaking, peace building, and peacekeeping with the authority of the Accord in every corner and locality of South Africa. I think we've been hearing that peace is a messy process and it's hard work. It doesn't just happen. So these structures were homegrown in South Africa. They were based largely on the structures that had worked in industry, especially on the mines, when management and unions had come to agreements, as they did during the 1980s after unions were legalized, to recognize one another and to commit to codes of conduct and to implement these agreements at shop floor level through shop stewards committees. So people, management and unions knew that this kind of thing could work, and they wanted to transfer it into the political realm. So the National Peace Accord contains codes of conduct, 2 codes of conduct, one for the political parties, promising not to kill one another, not to take down each other's posters, not to prevent others members going to meetings, etc. And one for the police, a code of conduct which commits every individual police person to be a servant to the community, and a further set of undertakings by the police which enshrined the new philosophy of community policing. It also contains a standing commission of inquiry into the prevention of public violence and intimidation. Note, not a punitive inquiry, but a healing inquiry to come up with recommendations as to how to do things better in future, which it did. It was the Goldstone Commission. And provisions for socioeconomic reconstruction and development. And vitally, the Accord also contains the structures to implement itself. And we can get rid of this. Go away. This is the peace structures as they are first set up. At the top, you've got the National Peace Committee, which is kind of presiding over the whole process and is the fount of consensus legitimacy. Then beside it, you've got the National Peace Secretariat. Its members are in part nominated by the National Peace Committee, but it channels government money. So it sits, in fact, directly under the Department of Justice, first of all, and then Home Affairs. The National Peace Secretariat had the responsibility to set up the regional committees, and so the whole country was divided into 11 regions, and they were at first called dispute resolution committees. After a year or so, they decided to turn their name into peace committees, which the press had already done. And under them, each region had the power to appoint, or to call together consultative meetings, which would appoint local dispute resolution committees or local peace committees. So you've got the national, the regional, and the local committees with a good deal of subsidiarity, because South Africa is a very varied place, and each region, for example, the Western Cape would be very different from the Northern Cape, and from the far north, and from KwaZulu-Natal. So each region had a lot of power to decide how it would approach matters. And again, each local committee also had a good deal of local power. And it was a top-down rolling out, but with a lot of consultation, and in the end, a lot of buy-in at grassroots. So the Goldstone Commission had its own committees of inquiry and investigation units. Beside this, this is the police board, which did a lot of workshopping and thinking, the top police leaders and leaders of civil society, expert criminologists and so on, actually putting together the strategy of community policing for the South African police. So the structures developed, and in particular added these divisions for communications, training, facilitation, full-time facilitators working under the Accord, some fundraising for socioeconomic reconstruction and development, and its own office. And the National Peace Committee developed a complaints investigating committee of lawyers, which helped to draw the sting of complaints about this party and that party had breached the Accord and so on. The members, importantly, civil society is represented on the National Peace Committee and the regional and local committees, largely religious bodies and business and community groups, and also the security forces and, of course, the political parties. So coming together for the first time ever in the history of South Africa. Here is, let me get rid of all this. And I've got to now. I'm about to show you a picture of a typical local peace committee. Having a weekend away. So this is Alexandra Township, Johannesburg. And here you've got the IFP, the ANC, the army, the detective type police, the internal riot security police, the internal stability unit it was called, or the instability unit if you like, the head of Women for Peace in Alexandra, Heather from business, Brian from business, me from churches, displaced people, and this guy is from the hostels, in the Inkatha dominated hostels. So this is September 1992. We've been going since April, and Alexandra is beginning to lose its violent image. The tasks of the committees were conflict resolution, so a lot of training in conflict resolution, mainly Harvard-based, so a lot about positions and interests and needs, and training and facilitation, and implementing the codes of conduct, above all, by joint planning and monitoring of events, such as rallies and marches and funerals, which had always been deadly flashpoints before, but now became an opportunity for joint pre-planning and coordinated action to produce a peaceful event and debriefing afterwards. So this was the meaning of peace monitoring under the Accord. And this is what it could look like on the ground. And these are Inkatha rally goers being separated from the ANC lot, and there were thousands in each crowd, and they're passing each other at a crossroads by agreement with peace monitors and international observers. We had them from the UN, Commonwealth, Europe, and the OAU, all working with the peace committees. And they're standing in a line to separate the otherwise warring groups of Inkatha and ANC rally goers. And monitor training developed, and so did what monitors war. This is election day, when the peace structures fielded 18,500 locally trained peace monitors and had the best communications and logistics operation of any organization, except perhaps the army, and materially helped with the peaceful election that South Africa had in April 1994. So this is Bishop Peter Story of the Methodist Church and 2 monitors in Soweto on election day. We also began to implement socioeconomic reconstruction and development, and expected to do a lot more after the 1994 election. Now, the other thing that the peace structures did was publicity, communicating the idea and the hope of peace, and mobilizing the whole nation to get involved in doing things for peace. So by September 1993, this was working. The peace song became a unifying anthem for the country, and the new peace doves symbol was everywhere, and everyone wanted the t-shirt, and literally millions were either given or sold. And there was a peace day on the 2nd of September 1993, so it's taken 2 years to get to that point. Here's a clip of one of the TV adverts. With the peace song.
Only if we all work together and spread a message of peace can we build a future for our children. Let's show the whole world we can bring peace in our land.
And I think that's probably all I've got time for at the moment. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Let me start by saying that for Rodemos el Diálogo, it's a great pleasure to co-organize this conference with Oxpeace. And in particular, because with this, we also mark the beginning of the celebration of our 10 years of existence. With that, let me perhaps start with a quote precisely from Rodemos el Diálogo, which it could seem obvious, but I sometimes think that it's not. What we have been saying for the last 4 months in Colombia is that peace is political, and it requires the commitment of diverse and multiple sectors that make up society to come together with a common aim, and the political will of a government with a mandate to manage resources and coordinate efforts to transform social conflict. So those of you or those people in the world who believe that peace is a technical effort are totally deluded. Peace is absolutely political. I would say geopolitical. And we need to understand the complexities of politics and geopolitics in order to know how we go about building peace. I want to do this talk following the following structure. First, I want to give you a background of Colombia. Then I'm going to walk through 6 structures for peace that were created in the context of the peace agreement in Colombia. I'm going to talk a bit about how that has been going during the implementation, and then I will offer some final remarks. I know that sounds quite a lot, and because of that, I'm going to be quite general, and I hope that I can answer some of the questions in the Q&A. So for those of you who are experts on Colombia, please forgive me. This is the background, and the background starts like this. In 2010, President Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia decided to start peace negotiations with the FARC. The FARC is the Marxist-Leninist insurgency created in 1964 in Colombia. Those secret negotiations took place for 2 years. And then in 2012, President Santos started four years of negotiations in Havana. Those negotiations got to a final peace agreement in August 2016. 297 pages, 578 stipulations in this final peace agreement, covering 6 points: rural reform, political participation, end of the conflict, solution to illicit drugs, rights of the victims, and the implementation of the peace agreement itself. The implementation had to start after a referendum in which Colombians, for 50,000 votes, rejected the peace agreement. In October 2016, only the mobilization of Colombian civil society and the support of the international community, giving Juan Manuel Santos the Nobel Peace Prize before actually managing to sign the final peace agreement with the FARC, stopped the return to war in Colombia, and it opened a window of opportunity for a renegotiation of the peace agreement. A new deal was this time approved by Congress, and implementation started afterwards, with a very difficult geopolitical context. I say geopolitical because Trump had won in the US, and also because this created a deficit of governability in Colombia for President Santos, and his previous political allies started to work against him. The rocky implementation of the peace agreement became even more difficult in 2018, when a president was elected with anti-peace mandate. Duque took office, and key institutions created to offer security guarantees to former FARC combatants as social leaders have been sidelined. Today, 1,343 social leaders and 315 former FARC combatants have been assassinated. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, there are 6 armed conflicts unfolding in Colombia in different regions, like Arauca, Catatumbo, Nariño, Chocó, Coca, and Putumayo, and involving a multiplicity of actors like FARC dissidents, paramilitary and criminal groups, the security forces, and other insurgencies like the ELN, the People's Liberation Army, and the National Liberation Army. However, 10 years on, since the beginning of this latest phase of peace building, and amidst a polarizing presidential campaign, which reveals the agonistic nature of peace and reconciliation, the seeds of peace surviving some of the multi-level peace infrastructures that were created during implementation of the 2016 peace agreement. So what I want to do now is to talk about some of them. As you can see, I'm not going to go through all the 578 stipulations because it would take us probably the next 5 days. But the first structure I want to talk about is the Truth Commission. The Truth Commission was set up in 2017, started working in 2018. 11 commissioners were selected by an independent selection committee made up of 2 Colombian nationals and 3 internationals. And the Truth Commission started the mandate in October 2018. They organized a big event in Bogota, but surprisingly, President Duque didn't attend the opening of the Truth Commission. The Truth Commission decided to divide the work in 11 regions, 10 of them in Colombia. You can see them in the map. And then one that they call the international sort of region. The Truth Commission in the last 3 years has been documented the testimonies of victims, perpetrators in 23 countries around the world. It is perhaps the most ambitious effort ever done in terms of documenting victims outside of a country by a Truth Commission. The Truth Commission is gonna release the final report in the next coming months, on the 28th of June, 2022. And I think that would be a really important element that this structure is gonna offer to Colombia society to continue building peace, even though President Duque has not been very supportive of the work of the Truth Commission. The next structure I want to talk about is the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace is the judicial branch of a very comprehensive transitional justice mechanism. This Special Jurisdiction for Peace is made up of 3 chambers, one that is called the Recognition Chamber, where the most responsible actors of the armed conflict come and acknowledge responsibility and offer full truth. And if they do that, they will get a special sentence. There is another one called the Amnesty and Pardon Chamber. This one is the one that offers amnesty to those who have not committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. And there is a resolution chamber for those who had problems with the justice system in Colombia, but it can be proved that they did not participate in war crimes. On top of that, there is a peace tribunal, and this peace tribunal is the one that in an adversarial process would dictate sentences against those who deny responsibility for what they have done. And there is an investigation and accusation unit that is actually in charge of finding all the evidence to show that these people have not said the whole truth. So far, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia has opened 7 cases, one about the kidnapping carried out by the FARC, another one by extrajudicial killings carried out by the army, which actually presented innocent people as guerrilla fighters to try to show that they were winning the war. There are 3 cases about different regions. One is Urabá, the other one is Tumaco, and the other one is Coca. There is another case about the destruction of a political party called the Patriotic Union, and there is another case about the forced recruitment of child soldiers. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace has done an incredible progress, has regional offices across Colombia, even though President Duque actually tried to contest the organic law that was presented to put into function the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Last week, for the first time in the history of Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace carried out a public hearing in which army officers, including a general, acknowledged responsibility to the victims and to Colombian society for the extrajudicial killings of these innocent people, offering dignity to the victims. The next structure I want to mention quickly is the UN mission to Colombia. And this is really important. The mission was created to Colombia thanks to the UK. The UK was the pen holder in the UN Security Council in 2016, asking for a political mission to come to support implementation of the peace agreement. This mission has had there have been 2 missions. The first one was really about monitoring and verifying how the FARC were gonna leave from their camps in the jungle and move into some transitional and normalization zones. this UN mission was part of a tripartite mechanism in which the UN, the Colombian army, and the FARC created all these monitoring mechanisms. That first mission also had the responsibility of certifying the decommissioning of weapons by the FARC. This took place in September 2017, when finally all the weapons of the FARC were decommissioned, and that first commission ended. When that first commission ended, President Santos requested to extend and create a new UN mission. The second UN mission to Colombia started working in 2017, and they decided to only create this mission for a year. And ever since, the UN mission to Colombia the mandate has been extended year by year. But in 2017, the decision was that the UN mission was going to focus only on 2 points. One, make sure the socio-economic reincorporation of former FARC combatants. And second, try to monitor the security guarantees for former FARC combatants in Colombia. They've been doing that until now. In 2018, when President Duque got to power, people were skeptical, didn't know if he was going to renew this mandate, but at the end he did it. And actually what happened last year is that President Duque has requested the UN mission to extend the mandate to also monitor and verify the sentences that former FARC combatants are going to pay in some of the regions of Colombia, thanks to the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. So now this UN mission is articulating to the implementation of the transitional justice restorative sentences that the former FARC combatants are going to receive. And actually, not only FARC combatants, this is including also members of the army, because according to the transitional justice mechanism that has a restorative justice focus, the perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity will have to work in the communities, in the regions more affected by the conflict, and the UN mission would be verifying that that happens. Let me now move quickly to, unfortunately, I did this in Mac, so these things happen. Let me move to the National Reincorporation Council. The National Reincorporation Council is a body created with members of the FARC and the government. It's got a legal backing, but it hasn't really got finances. What that means is that most of the responsibility of the National Reincorporation Council lies on the hands of the Reincorporation Agency of the Colombian government. They are in charge of approving collective productive projects for members of the FARC. So far, they have approved more than 190 projects to get these collective projects going. And they usually work with what is called territorial reincorporation councils created in 16 zones of Colombia, where former combatants are reincorporating collectively to economic life. This council, unfortunately, according to many people, has become stuck, in particular because there is no willingness on the Colombian government to see the FARC as an equal counterpart. The next infrastructure or structure I want to talk about very quickly is the National Coca Crop Substitution Plan. The whole idea was that the government was going to invite Colombian coca farmers to be part of developing this substitution plan. That was the aspiration, but unfortunately, after 5 years of implementation, what has happened is that the Colombian government stopped talking to the coca growers and has mainly used forced eradication of coca crops. So there is large dissatisfaction amongst Colombians who were doing coca crop substitution today. Finally, I want to mention the territorially focused development plans. The idea was that in 16 regions of Colombia, there were going to be these development projects. And unfortunately, this also lies on the hands of the Colombian government. In the final part of this implementation of these development plans, there is a very serious concern because in the implementation of the plans, the communities haven't been consulted. So again, the government hasn't really been paying attention to them. So my final remarks are three, because this is what I want to leave you with. First, peace infrastructures that are heavily dependent on the government's political will have failed to deliver. That's the example of the National Reincorporation Council, the National Plan of Substitution of Crops, and the territorially focused development plans. Second, peace infrastructures that have a large degree of autonomy from the government and enjoy international support have kept the peace process going. This is an example of the Truth Commission, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and the UN mission. And finally, and I haven't mentioned this at all here, but I think it's related to what John Paul Lederach was saying, and Tanya, informal peace infrastructures, not discussed here, have all the potential because they rely on spontaneity, which nurtures curiosity and creativity, enabling them to face the challenges posed by the politics of peace. And that's usually the case of what civil society organizations do, and that's certainly the case of Rodemos el Diálogo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. If you want to come and join us at the table, and without further ado, let's hand over to Brandon, who's going to talk about the case of Northern Ireland.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much. And thank you very much for inviting me here to speak to you today. I am going to talk about Northern Ireland, as was mentioned. And for those of you who saw the abstract, I took the title for the paper from a poem by Seamus Heaney, which is called The Follower. And it's a poem where he talks about his father plowing a field and how basically he was just an annoyance to his father. And he uses this line in it and he says, "I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always." And then he goes on to say, which is sort of sad in a way as well, he says, "But today it's my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away." And in a sense, he's trying to talk about, I think, the sort of cyclical nature of life. But I took that line of sort of tripping, falling, and yapping to talk about the peace structures in Northern Ireland in a way as representative of a process where actually quite a lot of ploughing has happened. Quite a lot of positive developments have taken place since 1998. The violence has decreased dramatically. There have been institutions that have been functional and dysfunctional at different points in time. But continually throughout this process, there has been this process of tripping and falling and yapping, and the institutions have collapsed at different times. Certainly as Brexit has approached, they have not really been able to fully hold together. Some of the underlying tensions that existed before have not been fully addressed. So in some ways, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of a process that got somewhere, but I don't think fully fulfilled its potential. And in some ways, some of those divisions of the past, as in that poem, are sort of re-emerging in this cyclical type of a way. So it's a sort of success story, but not a success story. It's also quite difficult for me to talk to you today about this because the election is currently unfolding. So I might sort of look at my phone in between and correct my talk as I go along. And so it is quite difficult. But what we do know, based on about half of the seats at the moment, is it does look like there's a fairly seismic shift happening within the Northern Ireland context. And the Sinn Féin, in fact, is now going to emerge as the largest political party rather than the Democratic Unionists. I'm not going to go into the history of Northern Ireland. I don't have time. So hopefully you broadly know what I'm talking about. But it's a seismic shift. Now, in some ways, we could say that's a success of the peace process, that actually the institutions have produced this type of a change. But at the same time, for those of us who live there, I think there's a real anxiety that because these underlying tensions are not being addressed, that in fact, the institutions may not hold out, that they may not be reformed post this election, that the DUP might not go back into government. So there's a shift happening, again, positive, but how will this actually go down? Will it actually hold together? So how does this relate to the peace structures? Well, what I wanted to firstly note is that there's been an enormous investment in Northern Ireland, an investment which for most people working in other contexts, one would only be envious of. Of course, there was a massive political investment. I'm not going to talk so much about that. I'm going to talk a little bit at the middle level. But at the political level, there was an enormous investment from the British government. Tony Blair, for all his failings, paid significant attention to the process, as did Bertie Ahern, as did the United States, probably an example of one of the few processes that they've been involved in that has been successful. There was a large political investment, but at that middle level, there was an even larger investment. Over nearly 25 years, there's been close to 3 billion or maybe more euro invested in community-based infrastructure, in community-based programs. Some of that from the Atlantic Philanthropies, from the International Fund for Ireland, but a significant amount of it through the EU Peace and Reconciliation type of program. And we've seen through that program, thousands and thousands of programs supported. If we look at between 1995 and 1999, 15,000 funded projects totaling 730 million, just by way of example, 22,000 projects funded between 2007 and 2013. These included, I suppose, what we typically call people-to-people peace-building work, history projects, art projects, shared schools, relationship building, dialogue, arts projects, and so on and so forth. There's a long catalogue of some of the impacts of that. The IFI, the International Fund for Ireland, one of the donors, talks about creating 55,000 jobs through this process. 13,000 children engaging in shared schooling types of programs. Some of the other donors claim that it's brought people back into the welfare system, for example. And as we know, at a broad level, yes, violence has definitely decreased. Inter-community connection is stronger than what it was. What the social surveys show is actually quite interesting. And it was interesting, I think John or Tanya, I can't remember, mentioned having patience. We can clearly see that attitudes have changed. So if you ask people how have relationships between Catholic and Protestant communities changed in the last 5 years, they show a steady increase over the last 20 years, but a very small increase. So for those of us who are not very patient, it's quite difficult to see because it's an improvement, but it's quite slow. And interestingly, it actually doesn't show, the data does not support this idea that young people dramatically think different to their parents. And in fact, because the society remains deeply divided, in fact, when you ask young people about how do they feel about other communities, they often actually show more negative views than their parents because they've had no experience of that. Whereas because of equality legislation and so on and so forth, most adults, in fact, are operating in a mixed workplace. Whereas for most children, 93% are still going to schools which are segregated. So it's actually only as an adult that you might have more of a positive experience with the other community. So we see attitudinal change, but quite slowly. So what are some of the lessons that we could take from this? As I mentioned, some of the successes, but we've also seen really significant tensions over Brexit, over the Northern Ireland Protocol, a repolarization of politics, which in fact is what has played into the current election results as well. So what are some of the lessons we've learned from that? I'm going to mention 5 in terms of peace infrastructure. And the first is that there's really been this tension between an institutional idea of what peace building is and a relational idea of what peace building is. And so if we look at some of those earlier investments that I mentioned, they were very much built around this model of peace by prosperity. It was sort of this EU idea that if we just got everybody working and we got everybody, their lives lifted up, that somehow these other types of political and inter-community issues would disappear. To some degree, that has worked, but to some degree, it hasn't worked. we sort of made the very easy realization that in fact you can be a poor bigot and you can also be a wealthy bigot. And that we see that at times in the polls. And so there's been this tension between we just need to uplift the economy versus other models where people are saying, well, actually it's about the relationships. It's about how people relate to one another. And we've seen this tension all the way through these infrastructure on this type of issue. The second, and it really relates to that, is that actually the people-to-people work that I talked about being invested in has often actually run on a different track to the political track, that the two of them have actually often run in quite different sequences. So we can show a lot of positive development at community levels. It hasn't always moved up, if we think about it in terms of the models that John Paul Lederach was talking about. And I think there's a very interesting lesson from Northern Ireland. And one of those is that actually we invested very heavily in the community relationships. In the early days of the peace process, we invested very heavily in the political relationship process. We took politicians to South Africa and they met Mandela. And I see John Alderdice sitting there played a significant role in a lot of those types of visits. We actually invested in the relationship building. They got to know each other. By the time they signed the agreement, actually there had been, no one was like massive friends, but they got to sort of know each other and there was some connection. We invested in trust. We then set up the institutions and we said, right, well, we'll invest in communities. We'll fix up the relations in communities. Once these institutions are running and everyone's around the table together, it'll work fine. And actually what we've seen over 20 years is that that trust has gone down at the political level. It might have gone marginally up at the community level, but at the political level, it's gone completely down. So we didn't really invest in relationship building at a political level. We assumed the institutions would somehow take care of that. And in fact, when people got down to the real business of where does Northern Ireland belong in the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, they realized their differences were really, really deep. And they got worse at the political level rather than better, even though they were cooperating with each other. The third lesson, and this in a sense comes from the work that Grania Kelly and myself have done, and I won't go through it here, but we speak about reconciliation in Northern Ireland as having 5 dimensions. The first is building a common vision. The second is dealing with the past. The third is actively building relationships. The fourth is attitudinal change. And the fifth is socio and economic equality, or building the sort of economic infrastructures under peace building. And what we've seen in Northern Ireland is really a failure to deal with the top 2 levels. The top 2 levels of how do we create a vision and how do we deal with the past. We've seen an investment in relationship building. We've seen, although in the last 5-6 years it's gone backward, we've seen some development in the economic infrastructure, but actually it's those top levels. And when I say common vision, I don't mean the same political vision. What do we want for our future? It's interesting watching the video that Liz put up, and being from South Africa, I often think of South Africa as exact opposite on those 5 dimensions. We invested dramatically in political vision. We invested in dealing with the past. What were we really bad at? Relationship building and the economy. And actually Northern Ireland was stronger on the bottom 2 than they've been on the top 2. But having said that, what we fail to really acknowledge is that where the reconciliation work has to happen is in the tensions between those levels. In the tension between saying, well, to build an economy, we have to invest in one community and not the other community, but we want you to build a relationship with that community at the same time. Or to create a common vision, we have to build a peace process, which means that prisoners are going to come out of jail. But at the same time, we want you to also work towards a common vision or build a relationship. And I think we fail to see that it's actually the tensions where the relationship, where the reconciliation is built, rather than a mechanical delivery of relationship building, of building our institutions. The fourth area, and I'll move towards ending, is that what we've seen is also very different models of reconciliation operating. Our research on a lot of community groups, they've tended to often operate on what we call an individual transformation model, that you sort of build peace by changing individuals, and then you bring them into contact with one another, and then you build this sort of compact out. And because in Northern Ireland, the 2 levels, the top level and the middle level, have not always been connected, actually those relationship building has not always resulted in a sort of change in the structural or a feeding into the structural, whether it's a social justice type issue. And then at the top level, we've essentially seen a very thin model of reconciliation. Reconciliation is essentially coexistence. As long as the political parties are talking with each other, stuff's going on, you walk down one side of the street, I walk down one side of the street, and so we'll coexist. But actually, it hasn't really been enough to fully cement this peace process. So we've seen these different models operating with each other. The fifth area where I think we have lessons to learn from, and was interesting because John Paul and Tanya mentioned them as well, is that we've often seen a very disaggregated approach to how we fund peace building. And it's really, they both use the word NGOization. I use the word projectivization. We turned the world into a series of projects. And so how do we measure the peace program? The numbers I gave you there. I actually had to do one of those evaluations. So I started working on the evaluation, said, how many projects have we got to evaluate? 15,000. And can you summarize that into a 4-page statement for the EU? So what we've done is we've projectivized it. And the result of that has been, if we think of young people, for example, there are projects for young people who are seen as victims. So if they lost a parent, they're part of a trauma program, a victims program. Then there's programs for young people at risk. Young people who are maybe at risk because of antisocial behavior or drugs, or then there's programs for those who might be under threat from paramilitary type organizations. But actually, you don't necessarily see programs which try to bring all three of those things together. And so by funding at the rate that we did, we often ended up splitting the work rather than looking at it collectively. So where does this leave us? And I will end on this, and there's so much more that I could say. A quick couple of lessons or recommendations from it. Firstly, for me, I think what we've learned is that actually relationships matter at all levels of the peace process, and particularly in divided societies. So building a road is never building a road in Northern Ireland. It's like, who benefits from that road, themans or themans? So there's always a relationship dimension. And I think, as I've said, I think we invested at the community level, but we sort of failed over time to fully invest at that relationship level, at the political level. And that's quite hard because politicians don't really want you to sort of say, we want to build trust between you, blah, blah, blah. The second is, and John Paul said this actually, I used different words. I said that you need to fund an interconnected process over a long time, at least 20 years. It's just quite interesting what you said. Perhaps we need to fund an interconnected web of environment process over 20 years. The EU funded the peace process for 25 years, and they funded it in 5-year tranches that often didn't always overlap. If we had set out at the beginning and said, let's fund a 25-year process, it would have looked completely different today. The final two points is that some of the institutions do matter. So we've had a Community Relations Council, an Equality Commission, a Human Rights Council. And it's interesting, as the political trust has decreased in Northern Ireland, we've actually seen a tailing off of investment in some of those institutions that were supported during the peace process. And perhaps my final recommendation is that we also do need to get the conceptual right. And I think that the failure to really say, what do we mean by reconciliation in Northern Ireland? Is it just coexistence? Is it that deeper relational change? The failure to really understand what we even mean by peace. And at the moment, within the peace building area, the failure to really connect that with environmental change, with economic degradation, with the welfare system, with social justice questions, is a big unanswered question. So I think we do have to also get sometimes the conceptual issues right. So I hope that gives you some insight, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Brandy. Great. I'm going to ask Raja if you can come and do your presentation. I'm a little conscious on time, so I'm going to ask for indulgence to take a little bit of time from lunch so that after Raja's presentation, we can still have some time for some discussion. So, over to you.
Thank you. I realize that I'm probably the only thing standing between you and lunch, so I'll be I'll remember that. You know, it's really after such wonderful presentations and you know, in front of people like Jean-Paul and John, I feel quite humble actually. And I'm trying to share today is my own experience. And again, this is not on behalf of the organization I work for, but my own personal experience as a peace builder, and my experience with community peace builders. You know, this is a wall that in the citadel of Babylon, where the hand that's said to in the book of Daniel, a divine hand is supposed to have you know, come and written a prophecy on a wall, and this is supposed to be, the legend has it, this is that wall. So, and that's where we get the phrase, the writing on the wall. So I wonder sometimes, you know, if conflict in some communities, you know, is it really inevitable? Is it the writing on the wall? Now, we tend to believe that peace is the natural state and conflict is the aberration. But what if it's the other way around? What if conflict is a natural state and peace is the anomaly? And all that we're experiencing now when we talk of peace are peace spells. Sometimes they're long. In fact, the era since World War II in Europe definitely has been called the peace spell. Sorry, the long peace actually. And we often wonder if, therefore, you know, peace is not necessarily, it's not a guaranteed finish line, but it's actually a much needed pit stop for us so that we recover as a society. I say this because of the way we imagine the levels of peace building, local, regional, national. We sometimes, you know, it's easy to think of it the way we look at governance, right? Local government, regional government. So like a Matrushka, you know, doll. But what if it's actually more of an abacus, where each of them has a place, it has a place value, local, regional, and they don't always, you know, coincide. You can have peace at the national level, but not so at the grassroots. You could have a peace at the grassroots, but you could have, you know, MPs going at each other's throats in parliament. So you could, and this is therefore, it's moving, but each of them has a place value, and you will never get the complete picture, especially when you look at peace as a process of multiplication of you know, benefits for the parties involved. Then you definitely, each place value counts. And we often talk about peace and stability, but I believe that again, the two of them don't always have to go together. And then justice is something that's, you know, very critical. And so we should probably be looking at peace, stability, and justice at all four levels. With that, I want to talk about Afghanistan and Iraq. These are, I spent almost 6 years in these countries, and I have found that the two of them are very different, extremely heterogeneous. I've had a turbulent history over more or less for at least 40 years plus. And whereas in Afghanistan, perhaps the dividing line in terms of identity is ethnicity. In Iraq, it is partly ethnicity, Arab Kurd, and partly sectarian. Now, what I found though was that no matter how everyone you speak to tells you a story of what they have gone through, and I will not bore you with the history of these countries, but when you go through these stories, you come to realize that every community in the country has been a victim at some point or another. And that, I think, is a very important thing to say whenever, as peace builders, we approach someone that, you know, and it's important to listen to them, but to also say that actually, yes, the other side may be the perpetrator, but they have also been the victims. And perhaps victimhood, in fact, perhaps presents a very strong meeting ground. I wanted to share first the case and the lessons that I learned from it. But before that, in Afghanistan and Iraq, the way we approached peace building was that we wanted to do community level peace building, was to ensure that we had liaison officers, or at least provincial officers in almost every province. At one point, the mission in Afghanistan, we had 23 officers, and then we went down to 8. But in all these cases, looking at, I'll just go back to this, looking at the diversity of the country and the fact that there are certain cultural regions in the country, Loya Kandahar, Loya Paktia, Kunduz, Jalalabad. This is how people in the country talk about that. Forget the provinces and the boundaries that are drawn up, which are frankly political acts. So based on these, we had regional offices. In fact, ISAF also, as you know, had regional commands. And then inside these, we had officers in each province who were drawn from the local community, reporting in. Now, what we found was we hired local staff. Most of them were knowledgeable, former civil servants. And they, worked with us at the international staff who were mostly sitting in regional offices. But the local staff were influential people, but they were connected. Sorry, they were connected people, but not necessarily influential people. That was actually, and then they reported on the conflicts to us at the regional level. What I tried at some point was to get them involved as peace builders. This was in Afghanistan, and I found that it was very difficult. Most of them did not want to take the risk of becoming facilitators, because every facilitator faced a certain type of risk, whether it was physical or reputational. So one of the things I also tried was to get them to learn from each other, to talk to each other. And I found that at best it could work inside a region, but it could not work across regions. With this, I went to, with this context in mind, I found that I went to Iraq, and that was in 2015. That was right, not long after ISIS took over Mosul, and in fact, 40% of the country's territory was under ISIS at that time, and it was a very difficult situation. And at sectarian, tensions were at an all-time high. And what again I found was first to look at the country as not by provinces, but to look at how people in the country described, it. So you had a region of Basra. So you have Basrawi, thinking. You had, Najaf and Karbala. That's one way of thinking. You had Kirkuk, another way of thinking. And then we had this liaison officers deployed in various provinces, and who were from the local communities. You could have someone who would perhaps born and grew up in a neighboring province, but they had to be within that cultural block. They needed to, fall within that block. And in this case, we found that unlike now, we had in Afghanistan, one issue we found was that a lot of the conflict was Kabul-centric. It didn't mean that it only happened in Kabul, but it was done to get attention from Kabul. In fact, whenever people talk about local, national, peace building, I often wonder, I do not like this word, but there's a word game, which you keep hearing all the time. I used to hear it all the time. Oh, this is how the game, that's the game, and this is how the game, works. And it's very unfortunate because it's actually, the lives of people at stake. But there are so many political games that are going on. And therefore, what you see as an act of violence at a local level is just a signaling by one perhaps actor to another at a national level. What happens at a national level then translates into acts of violence at a local level as an act of as an exercise of power. So much of our efforts at the community level did not bear fruit. In Iraq, again, context was very different. It was also because of the governance in Afghanistan was very Kabul-centric. The governors were appointed by the president and not elected. So everything was oriented. In Iraq, although again there was an elite that worked in the capital, and there were efforts at reconciliation between them, a grand bargain of sorts. But we found that in the provinces, in the hinterland, far from the front lines with ISIS, there were a number of other conflicts. And this meant that instability could spread at any point. In fact, arms that were captured, in the struggle, in the front line, sometimes made their way into the hinterland, and then that in turn, triggered new conflicts. So this was one case where, after we had these liaison officers, I tried something different here, and where there were two provinces, and in which our liaison officers were deployed, and there was an oil field on the border. Now the oil field fell in the inside one province, but the employees there were from another. So when the workers were not paid at one point, the workers went to their provincial government, who then summoned the company. But then the one which hosted the oil field said, "Hey, wait, who are you to talk to this company? They're on our soil." They said, no, wait, this oil field actually it runs all the way under our, So then it became a major, it was going to blows. And so it starts with something there, and then, it gets amplified in the media, and then people who want to, it's normal. People want to make, ambitious people are, join politics, and then it's part of, you never miss an opportunity in politics. And then it goes on, on the street. So these are just illustrative images. But what happens on the street is a symptom of larger political issue. So then what we did was we used the liaison officers in these two provinces to work as a team. And then they went to each other's provinces together. And we did a series of things, as a result of which basically we had an outcome wherein the governor of one province visited the other, and then they mutually decided that they'll do a redrawing of the border, and that they'll go to the capital and let the federal government, which basically which we said shun till then, take a decision on the exact boundary, but that there will be no room for violence, and they will talk to the company in question jointly. Fairly successful outcome. And all this done by people from the community, these peace builders, these liaison officers from the community. So what worked for us in this case? What was different from the experience in Afghanistan? Well, firstly, getting the context right, and I think defining the community by looking at the various layers of identity, so that it's not just sectarian, but it's also the provincial identity that can be very important. And whenever we talk about conflict analysis, I think we need to look at the sources of tension and the different ways in which it is expressed. And I feel like sometimes when you take a local peace builder, you need to look at how does she relate to what role does she play in your institution? What how long is this person deployed? And to be very sure that renown does not translate into impact. The relationship that we as external stakeholders have with a local peace builder is very critical to the success of the peace building effort. We in this case invested quite a bit in building skills of facilitation. But one of the most important things for me was that I was fortunate. I traveled to about 15 of the 19 provinces in the country to ensure that in each case our local peace builder, our local liaison officer was introduced to the local government as she's our lady, he's our man. So if you'd like to pass on any, message to us, please, you can do so through them. So that from being merely monitors, they got transformed. They were empowered in the eyes of the local power structures. And then getting the crisis right. Now, again, we talk about peace building, but often it's just about swinging from one crisis to another. And I feel that if we get the crisis right over a period of time, then we'll actually be able to build peace. In understanding the cost of doing nothing, and as compared to the cost of action, the cost of action often. The biggest concern for external peace builders is reputational risk. What if I fail this time? Well, if you fail this time, that's fine. The most important thing is that what if you don't act at all? And then if you try to go in at years down, and by the way, it may be another minor crisis, but a crisis are like layers of a conflicts are like layers of a meal-pie pastry. So they stack up over the years, and so it's whenever you try to cut through one, you realize that you're actually cutting through layers that have from decades ago actually. So when we say we prepare a theory of change, but you prepare an intervention strategy, but identify all potential satisfactory outcomes, which means that a satisfactory outcome could be that there is no violence, but no one is exactly the winner. Perhaps one side is a decisive winner, and the other side, for now, accepts the solution. So there could be any number of permutations on this. Identify all of them and be prepared for all of them. And then getting the intervention right. I think it was very important. Consent, of course, and we all understand the very fact that we had deployed these officers, we had the consent, but then identify who can back or block your intervention. And then engage the spoilers very early on, potential spoilers. To be honest, what I found was that there were a number of actors who were spoilers because they were not getting attention, or they were not going to get attention. And you need to understand, why is somebody being a spoiler? Is it for the sake of attention? Is it for the sake of ambition? Is it because they are insecure about losing, whatever they have within, their camp? And then use your peace builders to, use them in tandem, make them work in tandem, have them meet either side separately, and then either side together. Pass back channel messages. Whenever there was a time when one of our peace liaison officers, in the course of a crisis resolution, brought his colleague in from the other province, a neighboring province, and said, "This is my cousin, by the way. So he's just visiting. So we'd like to hear, by the way, what do you think of this crisis?" So it was a great opening, because it's normal, to sometimes bring cousins to meetings, but it kind of helped, for the cousin to for the work cousin to understand the narratives and the thinking here. In this case, we found, and it was important for us to identify champions, which meant that the deputy governor in one province and the provincial council's chairman in another province, we found them to be the most inclined to a peaceful settlement. We then empowered them as champions. Again, we did not come out, in the open and say that but we suggested potential interventions rather to the champions, and then let them do the trick. And the most important step, I believe, is to step back, because if you want it to be, the solution to be locally owned, and then you need them to, you need to step back. To just say that it's very important that the safety of local peace builder is the single biggest priority. And if this is compromised, you'll never go back. So and building the relationship is, what's most important. Even if you don't secure a satisfactory outcome, the relationship you build in the process, always works in the long term. you need to appeal to different things from a sense of leadership to the cost to community, to a sense of reason, but also to emotion. And to never lose sight of why we need, peace. Whenever we say, what exactly peace means, and I feel, life is full of suffering. And but there are different types of suffering. Maybe somebody didn't get a promotion. Maybe somebody didn't pass an exam. Maybe someone you loved broke your heart. Someone in your family has illness. This is acceptable suffering. This is the only type of suffering that the human condition should have. If we aspire that you do not have to worry for the safety of your family, you do not have to worry whether you'll return home when you go out. You do not have to, worry that if you speak out, you will never be able to speak up again. Then that is not unacceptable. So our goal as peace builders, my humble opinion, is to limit suffering to what is not natural to the human condition. This is I'd like to leave you with this. This is a picture I took this was in Herat in Afghanistan. And what I found was remarkable about this, 3 generations from one family. And it was, my grandmother used to say that when we are born, our destinies are written on our foreheads. And somehow, the furrows on their brows, all 3 at various different ages, it said something. The resignation of age, the anxiety of youth, the confusion of childhood, the fact that in all these cases, is something. I don't know about writing on the wall but I feel that as peace builders, if we can at least iron out these creases, then we have really been successful. Thank you.
Roger, please come and join the table. Okay, thank you to all 4 of our speakers. We are running a little bit over time, but I'd like to take a few minutes to open the floor for any questions, any brief questions, please. And I think I'd like to take a set of 3, which before we pass over to our panel. Sorry, I've got. Oh. Okay.
One of the things that struck me during the morning is the way that people have called for conceptual clarification. What do we really mean by peace or violence and so on? And it triggered in me, from my experience, that we also need to think about the concepts that they use, the people directly involved in the conflicts that we are concerned with, and how often our language can trigger hostile, negative responses in the communities we really want to influence, because they already have these preconceptions about particular words. And that creates problems for us before we start. So when Brandon says we need to broaden the idea of peace, I'm wondering, are there other concepts which are already there, which we can use, so that we begin to change? We need to understand what we mean amongst ourselves, but we need to take the meaning that's in the context around us more powerfully. All of it, I'll be very brief, but in the Middle East, as we often call it, there are many situations where if you talk of peace, you'll find yourself heading for the nearest door or the other side of the tree fairly rapidly, because peace means defeat. Just to say that in this context, a lot of peace builders, a number of peace builders from the research community and practitioners got together about 8 years ago now. We thought about how can we apply our learnings elsewhere to this place, which is so riven and fragmented. And we decided security was the label we wanted to work with. And we've been doing that for 6 or 7 years with some success, including now launching a national review, a national alternative security strategy. So you could find that on rethinkingsecurity.org UK. But it's just the general idea of what do we say to other people, and are we using their language, or are we already setting up opposition by trying to convert them to our own way of talking? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got another couple of questions. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Uday. I'm from Syria, doing a PhD in education and peace building at Cambridge. So from my point of view, very briefly, peace building is a process for power holders. It's a process designed to invite those who have the power to build peace. Usually they might be tribe leaders, militia leaders, conflict entrepreneurs. So we bring to the table those who might have already started the conflict to do peace. And I can't understand how those who started the conflict and led to the conflict can bring peace. And my question is, how can we shift the peace process towards those who might not be the power holders, those locals? In Syria, for example, we have a leader who has a record of killing 500,000 person, and he's the main actor in this peace process. And however, people below that leader, they might want peace. For them, peace is not political, it's a humanitarian. They are suffering. So if we shift the power from those at the top to those at the bottom, we might achieve something from my point of view. But how can we do this in a context like Syria? How can we shift the power to those locals? I don't know if anyone can share their reflection. Thank you so much.
Big question. And yes, please.
Hello, my name is Felicity Stedman, and I'm originally from South Africa and had some involvement in the National Peace Accord structures that Liz spoke about. I really have just found today absolutely enlightening and encouraging. And it just struck me, and it sort of links to the last point, is how can we move, we've become possibly good and even very good at the peace building part. And what we seem to need to be able to look at now and draw on the lessons of the speakers today is peace sustaining. Because if I look at South Africa, there was the Peace Accord, National Peace Accord, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the fantastic settlement at a political level. But where are we now? That has not been sustained. And we just hear it again and again, Northern Ireland and other places. So maybe there's a whole initiative around peace sustaining that we need to be talking about. So we don't, so we can contribute meaningfully and not lose the fantastic traction and work that's been done.
Okay, thank you.
My question is different. It's on the younger generation. Time and again, we have seen, be it South Africa, Rwanda, and the other countries, the transgenerational transfer of narratives and how that impacts how peace is built. And most efforts or concepts have focused around the people involved in the conflict or the people affected by conflict. But 10 years down the road, or 20 years, 30 years down the road, we see that it's the young people that carry on these narratives past and who become a ticking time bomb. How are we conceptualizing that or speaking about that, working around that to make sure that when we're building lasting peace, this important concept or category of people are brought into discussion? In 2016, I was in South Africa, and there was a massive strike by young people saying they were coming back for the dream that was sold to their parents in 1994. And most of them were probably 18 or 20 at the time. So they might have been born or were born after the 1994. So how do we ensure that the future generation are included in these processes?
So those we're going to have one more the final words, please, and then we'll let the panel.
I'll try and keep it quick. I think it's sort of building on the question of the gentleman over there. I'm Emma. I'm a first year. Is it on? Oh, there we go. Is that on now? Great. Yep. Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a DPhil student here, and I'm sort of interested. We talked a lot about sort of infrastructures within countries and some links to the broader one, but for building on this question of power, if we're looking at infrastructures of peace, do we not have to acknowledge the international structures that provoke conflict, that these are not internal questions of power and peace within countries, but they're also international questions of power where that intersect with these questions of peace and how we can kind of build it. And I think if we kind of accept the system as given, we aren't going to have peace. And I feel like there's some, I don't know, I just want sort of reflections on that sort of question of how within a system that is designed not necessarily to build peace, can individual structures have any impact at all?
Okay, thank you. That's a series of big questions, and thankfully we've got some big minds on the panel. I mean, I'd like to throw it open and maybe ask if there are members on the panel who want to pick up on particular points. Brandon?
Look, well, thanks. They're great questions, and they're probably too big to answer here. I think the language question is a really good one, and it's certainly something which in Northern Ireland has come up a lot. And I think you're right. Yes, maybe we have to find another language, but at the same time, I think we also have to co-opt certain language, and at other times we also have to challenge language. And I'll just give you an example. So a number of years ago, Grania Kelly and myself did some research in Northern Ireland, and we asked people about community groups about the word reconciliation. And they said to us they don't like to use the word. So that was sort of interesting, because we thought, well, they probably don't like to use it because like too many South Africans have imported it, or the EU's imported it. Actually, the reason they gave the answer to us why they didn't like to use it is because they said that people were not ready for it. So in other words, they instinctually understood the word reconciliation to be deeply transformative. They didn't actually understand the word to be something which was like coexistence, thin reconciliation. And I say this because at a political level, and then within the institutions, actually there's a massive reluctance to use the word reconciliation for exactly that reason. So then they started to use, I'm summarizing a very complicated discussion, the word community relations, which eventually then got watered down to good relations. And so now all the local councils develop good relations. It's a very, very thin concept of what we mean by social transformation. So yes, I think you're right. Some of the words we use can be off-putting, but equally, I think there's a need to push back on concepts like good relations, you know, where you're actually, yes, people are not ready, but how do you tackle that issue while at the same time not sort of depoliticizing or resulting in actually what's a very thin process of peace building. So that's just a little bit of a reflection from Northern Ireland. At the same time, peace contexts also develop their own language that can be mystifying, helpful and unhelpful. You know, so another one in Northern Ireland is single community and cross community. Now, what we know is that actually, or single identity and cross community, we know that nobody has a single identity, but everybody there knows what they mean by single identity, and they sort of know what they mean by cross community. So we have to challenge that, but at the same time, sometimes that's a useful way for people to express some of those differences. Some of my analysis of some of the policy documents in Northern Ireland, what's actually really interesting from a language perspective is that actually language has been slowly, like good relations, more and more disinfected over time. So when we look at, we've done some work on architecture, some of the documents from the 70s and 80s and 90s, they talk very explicitly about, let's do this here because this is a Catholic community and this is a Protestant community. By the 1990s and the 2000s, there's no mention of Catholic or Protestant, but the entire document is built around those assumptions. So when you read it and you know about it, you know exactly what they mean, but they're not saying what they mean. And so, you know, anyway, so I think it's a fascinating point. Maybe I'll move on to some of the others. Graham Simpson's going to address all the issues on the younger generation, so I might leave that to him, other than to say, it's a critical question. I mean, the other day, I was actually in a workshop with Graham and others, and somebody said, it was with young people, and they said, well, we weren't alive when the Good Friday Belfast Agreement was signed, so shouldn't we renegotiate it? And I heard I mean, John probably just swallowed really hard right there as well. So, you know, I literally saw everybody who was over 40 like go, like, oh my God, it was so hard to get to that point. We can't renegotiate it. But the point was right. The point was actually they weren't brought along with that process in the same way. I'd love to talk about international power, but maybe we can talk in the break about that.
Well, just briefly picking up on the problem that things are not followed through, and I noticed particularly Andre picking out initiatives that are left to the government tend not to be followed through. Unfortunately, that is very much what happened in South Africa. The government of national unity after the 1994 election shillied and shallied about whether they would keep the peace structures at all. And there was a particular problem that we had overspent over the election and needed an injection of funds, but not very much was needed to keep the show on the road. And I mentioned that socioeconomic reconstruction and development was mentioned in the peace accord, and what was in the peace accord was a chapter just laying out the basics of how you involve communities in development. And there had been some very good projects under the peace accord, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, which did carry out those principles. And the whole energy of the peace structures after the 1994 election was being redirected into socioeconomic reconstruction and development. And the peace committees certainly achieved a great deal of social cohesion. And all of that, unfortunately, was stopped because the government of national unity decided that the expertise in police community relations, for example, should somehow filter into the new community police forums at police station level. It didn't necessarily happen. And the expertise in development would go into the ANC's flagship program, the Reconstruction and Development Program, which was their manifesto in 1994. What actually happened, sadly, was that the peace structures were dismantled, and they were a whole fabric. You couldn't just say, well, the expertise can go somewhere else. It's rather like moving the Cheshire Cat's grin and forgetting about the Cheshire Cat. It kind of doesn't work. Anyway, unfortunately, the SERD, S-E-R-D, Socioeconomic Reconstruction and Development, didn't progress beyond 1994. A lot of the expertise was lost. Protests were already beginning by the end of the year about the lack of service delivery and so on. And over the last almost 30 years, there has been a failure in bringing in social cohesion. The difference between the rich, and some of the rich are black now, and the poorest has widened. There is at the moment a considerable concern about social cohesion. And some people are wondering whether something like a renegotiation, a bringing together of all of the government, civil society, and so on, to look at what the problems are now and to see, in the same way that they looked at them in 1991, these are the problems, how do we tackle them, to do a negotiation for social cohesion now in the present, and the involvement of youth would be immensely important.
Okay. Roger, please.
So very quickly, 3 questions I found very interesting, if I might respond to that to complement what my colleague said. One is, on peace building and how to shift it across, at different levels. So one thing we found in useful in Iraq was to understand what was the theme or issue that different layers, actors at different layers were interested in. For example, we found that there were a number of anti-corruption protests, some of which in fact continue to this day. And these anti-corruption protests, which would come up, in every province, they were fairly civil society led, fairly, non-partisan, and they'd come up every Friday. And we found that, based on these, what they were saying, we realized that perhaps devolution of power was something important. So then we introduced into the national reconciliation discussions at the capital level, the idea of devolution as of part of national reconciliation. We held a big conference. We invited, all the, the governors, and then, the framing was done. And once the discussion started, and then conversely, we engaged the protesters and we said, yes, but you realize that one way to a corruption-free society would be to, perhaps have a society where we have reconciled. And so then we started seeing in a week or two, placards come up saying one of the demands in the anti-corruption protest was national reconciliation. So this seeding of, what they want between different levels can actually, perhaps help bridge this gap. Then transgenerational transfer, the transfer of narratives, ma'am, like I said, one thing that I find very interesting is the concept of euhenemeri. Euhenemeri are essentially, it's a Greek word for, legends of the past that you would like to live up to, like perhaps every Greek child was, taught to be a Theseus or a Perseus, but it's this, thing of someone you would like to emulate, like if it's a Mandela. So, and what would it be like? What would Mandela do? What would you do in that context? It was some time back. There was a, in my own country, there was a Bollywood movie where a gangster discovers Gandhi, and then goes about telling people, Gandhi, the concept of Gandhigiri. What would Gandhi do, in this circumstance? And these things, help connect, the younger generation to to people who are merely figures in the textbooks. Lastly, the international relations question. I just feel that countries in conflict actually have a strong sense of nationalism, an undercurrent quite often, and that for all the failings of nationalism, I think it's an acceptable risk to take to work on that. I mean, how do you explain the fact that Afghanistan, after 4 decades of conflict, has not had a secessionist movement? So the fact that peoples have this strong identity of being Afghan, and similarly in Iraq we try to see this like Nahnu Iraqi, this thing of we are Iraqis and that we have this we are the descendants of Mesopotamia. That pride is something you need to appeal to, and then that sometimes helps disallay or keep at a distance the influences or effects from international quarters. Thank you.
Okay. Andre, I'm going to let you have the final word, the final brief word, and then I can hear Tommy's rumbling.
Okay, no, and probably I should have spoken first, because after what I'm going to say, probably no one wants to have lunch. I'm going to be the pessimist here. No, actually, no, basically what I wanted to say is the following. Starting from how to sustain peace. I think, I don't know if you have read this book called Why Everything Fails, or Almost Everything Fails. I think the only way to sustain peace is by not being afraid of failure. I don't know if you have heard Samuel Beckett saying, fail again, fail better. That's the point. And I think that is connected to the point of how do we actually try to make the shift between those who have power to those who do not have power. First, understanding that that's not a really good way of framing how power works, because as Foucault says, power works only because of relationships between different actors. So it's part of a network. And if we understand that, then we understand the real importance of spontaneity in those who do not have political power. And so my invitation is to think about a new way, or a new way of naming something that I think people like Paul Lederach and Tanya and Brandon have been speaking about. And we need to think, what does it mean to do spontaneous peace building from the part of civil society? Because when we think about that, there is a possibility of creativity, and there is a possibility of understanding obstacles as opportunities, not to create a perfect world, because such a world doesn't exist. We live in an imperfect process of evolution. We are imperfect creatures. We are not gonna create a perfect peace. On the contrary, we need to acknowledge that conflict and peace go together, and that death is necessary for life to continue. So I don't think we are going to get rid of war. But what we need to do is to continue striving to build better ways of interacting between human beings who aspire to live in coexistence without resorting to violence. And that will help us in a long, long run to transform the international structures that perpetuate conflict in some regions. And that's a geopolitical change that could take time to build and probably we will never see in our lifetime, but will keep us going and going.
I think those are excellent words for us to draw this to a close on. Liz, lunch?
Definitely lunch. There are sandwiches for 120 people, and that's somewhat more than the 90 or so we are at the moment. So you should have lots of lovely sandwiches. It is quite late. Should we start at 2:15? Would everybody be happy with that? Okay, prompt at 2:15 to start again. And may I draw your attention, I took the opportunity of putting a flyer for my book in the program, and there is another flyer outside, Simon Fisher's Working with Conflict, a new edition of it. So please take note of that. Thank you.